Welcome to another Lowe's Kitchen Bread Test, Loaf Pan Edition. We've tested brands of flour, we've tested brands of mixers. Today we are testing brands and styles of loaf pans. I've tested 8 different kinds and styles of loaf pans, from glass to ceramic, cast iron, different kinds of aluminums, you name it, same recipe, different pans, same oven, same temperature. We've tried to keep every single variable same except for the variable we are testing, and that is the loaf pan. Does the loaf pan make a difference? Is it worth spending a little bit more? Is it worth getting a different kind of pan? Today in our test, we're gonna find out. I say in all of my tests that none of them are sponsored by any brand. I paid for all of these loaf pans out of pocket. I'm just genuinely curious as a baker and a recipe developer if the loaf pan we use has a difference on the end quality, the end result of our loaf of bread. For all of these bread tests, I've been using the same recipe as well, my classic white sandwich bread. It's a recipe that I've used for years and years and years. I know it like the back of my hand. And even though I weigh every ingredient and I'm very particular, it's a recipe that I'm just super familiar with, very comfortable with. Seems like a really good one to do a tester on. Let's check out the process and the end results. The results were super fascinating to me. It was interesting that we had so many different shapes and sizes of the loaves, which is kind of expected with a different size of loaf pan. Of course, it's gonna mold to that shape, but that was interesting to compare them all back to back to back. It's also interesting to note how the browning really varied between the different materials. Every material you use conducts heat differently. It will heat up faster or slower and cool down faster or slower. So it's important to know what pan you're using when you make a certain baked good. It was no surprise to me that some of these materials, like the glass, the cast iron, the ceramic in particular, these 3, the loaves took the longest to cook in these. Not just because that they were thicker, but the kind of material that's used. Glass is a really slow heat conductor. It's really slow to heat up and really slow to cool down. So they work fantastic for things like casseroles and whatnot. But for baked goods, you actually want the conductivity of the heat to heat up pretty quickly and cool down really quickly. So I don't love using things like glass or ceramic when making things like bread. The next in the lineup, this Nordic ware pan and the Fat Daddios pan, both very similar in style in that they're pretty shallow, wide dishes. We saw from the outcome that it baked just like that. It baked almost like a little bit flatter of a loaf. And surprisingly, that actually did in turn affect the inner crumb structure slightly, which did surprise me. It didn't surprise me that it molds differently, but it did surprise me that maybe that could have a really small difference in the crumb structure. So I wasn't a fan of that. Visually, I don't think it looks as good, but they didn't bake up poorly by any means. I just wouldn't grab these sizes in particular first. There's nothing wrong about the material being used. It's mostly just the shape. So that's something to watch for when buying your loaf pan. Also, I really liked, if you're gonna choose a loaf pan, the ones that have handles are pretty handy. So I did love that one of the Nordic ware more, just because it was easy to get in and out of the oven, but the size was not my favorite, the shape. If you're gonna get a Fat Daddios pan, one pan that I actually love, because again, I'm a fan of the material, it's just a nice thin aluminum, heats up quickly, cools down quickly, great even baking. If you're gonna go for that brand, they have a different style that is a little bit taller. See how this is just a little bit taller than the other one? It's also just kind of a really perfect size. Usually I get 2 per batch, but when I use these pans, they're kind of like an 8x4 size. I'll link them in the associated post. I can stretch the recipe to make 3 loaves instead, and it makes it fantastic to give away. I can kind of stretch that batch, but it still feels like a nice, decent loaf size. So if you're gonna go for Fat Daddio pan, again, great quality, but try to pick something with a little bit higher of a side. Next in the lineup is silicone. Truthfully, I actually never baked with silicone before for my bread specifically, but I usually am a big silicone fan. This was nice and easy to wash. Also loved that it was dishwasher safe. I usually don't dishwash my other loaf pans, so I love that I could throw this in the dishwasher, cleaned up nicely, and it helped pop out the bread well, but you saw from the video, it did not bake very evenly. It was very spotty, which was very surprising. It was on the same rack as my other loaf pan, so I don't think it had anything to do with my oven, and that was kind of surprising. So just for that reason, cosmetically, it wasn't my favorite choice. My two favorite choices of all the loaf pans we used today were these last two. Both the material and the shape took it home for me. My two favorites was this Nordic Ware pan 9x5. So we tried a different Nordic Ware style. I prefer this one. There's also other brands like an Anchor Hocking brand of this same style that works really, really well. Cleans up nicely. I do hand wash these. I don't put either of these in the dishwasher, but they clean up so fast. They're not a big deal to hand wash. They're at a decent price point. And just baked nice and evenly and held a really nice professional even shape, which I loved, and had a great crumb structure. Next to that is our USA pan. By no surprise, this was my favorite. The structure of it, just the shape, was really beautiful. It baked very evenly. The only downside with the USA pans is it does come at a higher price point. Huge perk of it though is based on the material they use with USA pans, you do not need to spray them, which I love. My other, even though they're non-stick, my other non-stick pans, I still do a light spray with. These pop out so easily. You can bake anything in them. I also have other USA pans for our baking sheet and like 9x13 pans. You can put anything in them and they just glide out. My muffin pans, the muffins just pop out. I never have to spray it. So I love that I don't have to put those chemicals where my food is going to go for those sprays. So I love the USA pans, but again, it's just that price point. So if it's not quite in your budget, I would secondly grab this one. Slowly, if you can afford it, start building these USA pans into your collection. They're durable, they will last you forever, clean up super well, anyway, you will love them. The consensus is we definitely came home with two favorite kinds of loaf pans, but every single pan made really good bread. You may have to watch it and bake one longer or for less time based on the recipe you're given. That would be my number one tip, is whatever loaf pan you have, maybe a different loaf pan than the recipe you're following. So keep that in mind in regards to bake time. But if you have a collection of bread pans that you have that are in good shape, that you're using, I wouldn't feel like you need to run out and replace all of them right away based on this test. Keep making homemade bread, keep using the pans that you have if they're good, in good shape. But if you're looking to replace some current ones that you have, or want to gift one, or slowly add to your collection, or if you're starting from scratch, whatever, you want to get the right thing first, then you know what I would recommend. I hope these tests are helpful. You can find a link to the blog post with all of the links to these bread pans, a full breakdown in the caption below. And as always, happy baking.